All right, good morning, everybody. It is 9 a.m., so we are going to get cranked up. Hopefully, everybody can hear me. I'm excited about our training today. Today, I'm going to do a little different format than normal. I am going to go over a subject, and then I'm going to open up for questions, and then I'm going to have a private session for my executive staff only. So the format for today is I'm going to have a little Q&A at the very end so I can make sure that I get everybody's questions answers. Right now, everybody is muted. Everybody is on the off position. And I will unmute everybody in a little bit. All right, you all. Let's get started. It's a great day. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to have another training for you guys. If you all guys are logged in and you can see my my actual screen here on my computer, it says Buyer's Brokerage Agreement, and that's what we are going to be talking about today. We are going to be talking about Buyer Brokerage Agreement. As I know, there's a lot of questions on the Buyer Brokerage Agreement. Questions on should I use it? Is it good to use? The pros and cons. And we're going to discuss all of those things today. We will talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly so you can make a proper decision on if you want to use it for your business and also how to use it for your business as well. Because the Buyer Brokerage Agreement, I would say, is something new. When I say new, it's been around for a while, but I would say the last 5 to 7 years, more agents have kind of thought about using it or have used it, and so I want to definitely discuss that Buyer's Brokerage Agreement. So let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about first the buyer itself, and let's just talk about the system and how we get the buyers to contact us. So let's say we have a situation in which the buyer contacts us through the internet, through the web, via email, text message, or whatever. We understand the key to all buyers' leads is to contact that buyer very quickly. The quicker we can get back with the buyer, the better. So let's say we have received this lead, we have responded via email. Excuse me. We have picked up the phone. We have made that contact via cell phone. We have also sent follow-up emails. From there, we have sent the lead to our lender. The lead is qualified. This is a qualified lead, so we know this person can purchase, or maybe this is a person that's paying cash. So maybe it's a cash buyer. Maybe it's a person that's qualified for the financing. But whatever the situation is, the lead is qualified. So now that we know that the lead is qualified, our next step is to set up a one-on-one consultation. So now we're setting up the one-on-one consultation, and we're going out to actually meet our pre-approved buyer. To actually find out what they're looking for, how we can help them, how we can be successful achieving their needs. So now we go to this one-on-one consultation. In our briefcase, we should have a buyer brokerage agreement. Whether we're going to use it or we're not going to use it, we should always have a buyer's brokerage agreement in our briefcase. Okay. So now we have this buyer's brokerage agreement in our briefcase. Whether we're going to use it or not, we will talk about that a little later. But we have the buyer's brokerage agreement with us, and we have the buyer brokerage agreement ready to be used. So now what's our next step? What do we do next? We go on this consultation, and we're going to actually discuss the buyer's brokerage agreement. Now, what is it? Okay, what exactly is a buyer's brokerage agreement. Let me just break it down in nice, simple form, nice, simple terms for everybody. Buyer brokerage agreement basically is saying, I, the real estate agent, I am going to represent the buyer and the buyer only. I am going to represent the buyer's needs to the best of my ability. And because of that, I will be compensated, or I will be paid for that. Now, for years and umpteen hundreds of years, typically, the majority of the time, the seller pays the entire commission to both the listing agent as well as to the buyer's agent. And because of that, the buyer's agent was actually working for the person selling the home. So legally, we had I would say a obligation to the seller. This says, no, I am 100% working with the buyer. I only work with the buyer. And legally, I have a legal binding agreement. I have a legal agreement with the buyer and with the buyer only. So basically, the buyer's brokerage agreement is a binding legal contract between the buyer and the agent. So that is basically the gist of it. That's a kind of the down and dirty, quick legal understanding. Now, with that being said, there's some things in the buyer brokerage agreement that can, help you understand better. Now, what I'm going to do is I have another training that I've actually recorded that's going to be on Platinum DB under the resources section. That's going to actually go over the buyer brokerage agreement line by line, sentence by sentence, so you have a great understanding of the buyer brokerage agreement. I will not get that detailed in this particular training, simply because I have another training that really goes over the contract. Today we want to basically discuss the pros and cons, and should you use it, when should you use it, and is it beneficial for you? So let's talk about the history of the buyer brokerage agreement, because before you can actually use it and understand whether you should use it, you really need to understand the history. The buyer brokerage agreement is very common in commercial real estate. That was a kind of the birth of the buyer brokerage agreement. So in commercial real estate, you're dealing with very savvy investors. You are dealing with very high cost, a very high sales price. So the buyer brokerage agreement came about, and the buyer brokerage agreement basically said, I am going to represent the buyer. But since this is commercial real estate, sometimes there's a lot of upfront due diligence. Sometimes there's a lot of upfront work in the beginning. And so the buyer's agent will say, I will only represent you, but I need a retainer, a non-refundable retainer, to get started. And that retainer could be anything that was agreed upon by all parties. $15,000, $25,000, sometimes $50,000 to $100,000 retainer fee. I have been in hotel deals where it was $150,000 retainer fee to the buyer's agent or to the company of the buyer's agent up front before we even get started. And if it's a $100,000 retainer fee, maybe all of it is non-refundable. Maybe half is refundable, half is not non-refundable. So they're typically with commercial deals, when there's a buyer brokerage agreement, there's a retainer involved. Retainer meaning money. Also, that retainer says you're going to give me $10,000, $50,000, $100,000. And if the deal never happens, if the deal never closes, I, the buyer's agent, can keep all or a portion of the retainer fee, and this is because I have put forth a lot of due diligence up front. This is very common in commercial real estate. So in a commercial real estate deal, to ask for a retainer fee is not uncommon. It's not unusual. And buyers are kind of expected. And buyers agree and they live with it. Because that's how business is typically conducted with commercial real estate. So buyer brokerage agreement is very popular in commercial real estate. Buyer brokerage agreement is accepted in commercial real estate. Well, then the same buyer brokerage agreement kind of trickled down to residential. And same buyer brokerage agreement, or same type of buyer brokerage agreement, same type of thought with the buyer brokerage agreement. But we all know commercial real estate and residential real estate is quite different. Even if you look at residential multifamily properties, meaning 10, 12, 20 units, that's different than your everyday single family home. So the history. Buyer brokerage agreement started in commercial real estate. It's still very popular in commercial real estate, and it's very accepted in commercial real estate. Recently, in the last 5-10 years, the buyer brokerage agreement then became used a little more in residential. Okay, not a lot, but a little. So let's talk about some pros. The good point. The good points for the buyer, also the good points for you. You represent the buyer 100%. And the buyer understands that you will not disclose any information to the seller other than what's agreed upon. Your fiduciary responsibility is to represent the buyer. That's a good thing for the buyer. Also, it's good for you because you know you are representing this buyer. You have a contractual agreement. You have a retainer on file, and you know when you invest the time, when you invest the energy in this buyer's brokerage agreement, that you will be paid. You will be compensated when you have a buyer's brokerage agreement on file. That's the good part. Another great thing, you are guaranteed some type of a commission or compensation. Typically, a good buyer brokerage agreement basically says that the buyer agrees to put up a retainer fee. All of the retainer fee, a portion of the retainer fee is non-refundable, which guarantees you compensation. So when you do upfront due diligence, when you are assisting the buyer, you know that you have compensation. You will get paid something because there is a retainer fee involved. That's great. So that's a good thing. So one of the good things for us as an agent, it guarantees the commission. Now I will say this. You need to have experience, you need to be proven, and you have to sell your services to the buyer. Because if the buyer is going to put up a retainer fee, refundable, especially non-refundable, the buyer have to be convinced that your services and your product is worth the amount of money they are putting up with the retainer fee. Whether it's $1,000 or whether it's $100,000, you have to justify that retainer fee to the buyer. Also, in most buyer brokerage agreements, it clearly states that if the buyer purchases a property, you as the buyer's agent will get paid a commission even if they don't use you. So if the buyer decides, you know what, I'm upset at Luther Ragsdale, I want to go use another agent from another company, they go and they write a contract. A buyer brokerage agreement typically says, even if you use another agent Even if you buy a property and you do not use an agent, I will receive a commission. So for the next 90 days, 6 months, 12 months, whatever's agreed upon in that buyer's brokerage agreement, it basically states during this amount of time, if you, Mr. Buyer, purchases a piece of real estate, I will get paid a commission of 3%, 5%, 2%, 6%, whatever's agreed upon. This is a great thing. Okay, this is absolutely wonderful. So this guarantees is if this buyer purchases a property during the terms of the agreement, I, the buyer's agent, will receive a commission. I will receive compensation. This is a great thing. Okay, so that's a good thing. Now I do want to say, please remember that you have to justify your services, and I think that's very important. I think it's very important. We get excited and we say, "Wow, I could have a retainer of $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000." That's a great thing, but you have to justify your services, justify your experience, justify your expertise, to justify why it's worth you receiving that type of a retainer. Case in point, in a commercial hotel deal, you may have a company that says, you know what, I need a $100,000 retainer or a $50,000 retainer, but I am going to contact attorneys who have to draw up a special contract. I am going to contact attorneys who is going to give us legal advice on this particular commercial deal. I am going to bring in staff members to do market analysis and to put together different reports. And let's say the report is going to be a 100-page document, and this 100-page document is going to take us 3 weeks to produce. And during that 3 weeks, I am going to use 5 of my staff members to produce this 100-page document. So due to all of this due diligence, I have expenses involved in getting started with this multi-million-dollar hotel deal. And the hotel deal is a $100 million a hotel deal. And so because of the upfront due diligence, because of attorney fees, because of me paying staff and paying outside contractors to put together different reports, the non-refundable retainer fee is $100,000. In that situation, you can see for this particular commercial deal, I am justifying the cost of the commercial of the retainer. So it's very important to understand. One of the pros is we represent the buyer, but we have to justify that retainer fee. Okay, so the retainer fee is great, but we must justify it. So that's some great cons. We have a buyer brokerage agreement. We are guaranteed a commission, and we will get paid because we have a upfront retainer fee. Now, let's talk about some cons for residential. Now, I am talking residential here. No one is doing it typically. So the problem you have, a con, is if you are representing a buyer, and this buyer is buying a $500,000 residential home or a $250,000 residential home, most agents are not doing buyer brokerage agreements, and they're not doing a buyer brokerage agreement with a non-refundable retainer fee. So is if you say, hey, I would like a $2,000 retainer fee on your everyday residential home, I, the buyer, will then say, you know what? Why should I sign a buyer brokerage agreement with you when Joe Blow agent right around the corner will represent me and will help me without a retainer fee? That's the problem with residential. Right now, the market just does not demand a buyer brokerage agreement. Now, you could always have a person sign a buyer brokerage agreement. That's fine. And you can always ask them, hey, will you pay a retainer? If they refuse to give you a retainer, the buyer brokerage agreement basically has no power. It has no bite. It's kind of worthless. What good is the buyer brokerage agreement without the retainer? Most buyers right now, they're very savvy, especially with the internet. Is if you want a retainer fee of $1,000, what stops me from going back online, going to another website, and finding another agent who will not charge me a retainer fee, who will not charge me, or who will not require a buyer brokerage agreement? So the problem we have right now in residential real estate is buyer brokerage agreements are very, very, very rare. No one's using them. So it's very hard to compete. 99.9% of your deals, they do not have a buyer brokerage agreement attached with residential real estate. So that is a big, huge problem right now. Is if I am the only agent on the block asking for a buyer brokerage agreement with a retainer fee, and that retainer fee is non-refundable, why use me when that buyer can go online and find the next agent? And trust me, we all know there's more agents not doing it than doing it. So you would almost have to be in a situation where you was a kind of the only player in the game, and the market demanded buyer brokerage agreements. Right now, it's not happening. Buyer brokerage agreements, they're just not popular. And so since they're not popular, it's hard to compete. Okay? If you cannot compete in the market, why do it? So if you contact, 10 buyers, and we all know our goal is to get a qualified buyer, is if you receive 10 qualified buyers, they are ready to buy, they are qualified to buy. Do you want to have a buyer brokerage agreement and cut those 10 qualified buyers down to one qualified buyer just to have a retainer fee, just to have a buyer brokerage agreement? Is your decision, is your business model. Personally, I would do business without the buyer brokerage agreement if I'm dealing with residential real estate. And I think that's a very important point. Notice I said dealing with residential real estate. Now, if I'm dealing with a 10-unit apartment complex, a 12-unit apartment complex, totally different story. If I'm dealing with any type of commercial properties, that's a different story. But your everyday residential home, $400,000, $500,000 residential home, it just is not popular to have a buyer brokerage agreement. Can you do it? Absolutely. Is it legal? Absolutely. You can right now go into MLS or FMLS and you can look at a buyer brokerage agreement. You can print it out and you can ask. But most residential folk, most residential buyers typically just will not agree to your buyer brokerage agreement. That's your major problem. This is the same thing with investment property. Typically, you're a residential investor. You're ma and pa type of investor who's trying to buy some single-family homes, typically they will not agree to a buyer brokerage agreement because of that retainer fee. And if you don't get a retainer fee, what good is the buyer brokerage agreement? The retainer fee is the most important thing. So even when you deal with your investors, many times in the investors, now your typical buyer that's buying a residential home for their family, typically they are typically, not all the time, but typically they are pretty loyal. They work with one agent. If they hit it off with that agent, they trust that agent. They're working with that agent. Typically, they will work with one agent. Investors have a totally different mindset. An investor is looking for a great steal of a deal. And so many times investors don't like to be contractually committed to one agent, because if another deal comes along and they're looking to buy 5 properties or 10 properties or 7 properties, they don't want to be contractually stuck to one agent, because yes, I might want to buy 1 property from you, but I may buy 3 others from some other agent, because I'm an investor and I buy 5 properties at one time, and I might buy 2 from one agent and 3 from another agent. So I don't really want to be contractually stuck to just one agent, because I am an investor and I buy so many different properties. So that's a con with residential investors. So in the residential market, it is a very tough sale to sell that buyer brokerage agreement. I'm not saying it's impossible, but if that's what you want to do, you will limit your market on who you can actually do business with. So the question now becomes, all right, Luther, when? Luther, when should I, actually do a buyer brokerage agreement? When is the best time? Should I ever do it? Well, I would always suggest for sale by owner. If a buyer says, Luther, I want to buy for sale by owners. If a buyer says, Luther, I have a property, I would like for you to go and research this property, or I would like to show you, or I would like for you to show me a particular property, and this particular property is a for sale by owner, by all means, I want a buyer brokerage agreement. Why? Because a buyer brokerage agreement says I will get paid a 3% commission. Even if the seller will not pay me for some reason, the buyer brokerage agreement says the buyer is required to pay my commission. So here's the deal. If I have a for sale by owner, many times a for sale by owner, it is for sale by owner because they do not want to pay a commission. That's why they have listed the property for sale by owner. Now, in that case, I want a buyer's brokerage agreement, which says if the seller does not pay my commission for whatever reason, the buyer will agree to pay my commission. This is also another reason why it's very popular in commercial and is not popular in residential. In commercial real estate, it's wide open. Many times in the commercial arena, the seller, now I am speaking about commercial now. In commercial real estate, many times the seller will say, hey, I will not pay a buyer's agent. So in commercial real estate, the contract is very popular because a buyer broker says, if the seller will not pay my commission, the buyer agrees to pay me a commission of 3%, 4%, 5%, whatever you agree upon. Residential real estate is a totally different monster. typically it's just assumed that who pays the commission. Typically, the seller automatically pays the commission to both the buyer and the seller. That's just the kind of standard in the business at this time. So for the buyer to sign a buyer brokerage agreement stating that if we do not get paid by the seller, the buyer has to pay our commission of 3%, 4%, whatever we agree upon. Now, we also have to remember, sometimes dealing with, let's say, first-time home buyers, sometimes they don't have the financial ability to even pay me a 3% commission. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Going into a buyer brokerage agreement, does this individual have the financial ability to pay me 3% or 5% or whatever the case may be? So as if I am getting into a deal with a for sale by owner, and I know that the seller does not want to pay my commission, I need a buyer brokerage agreement that clearly states if the seller does not pay me a commission, the buyer agrees to pay me a commission in full, in the amount of X amount of dollars. Very important when I am dealing with for sale by owner. And I would also recommend, if you're going to have a for sale by owner and you know that the seller will not pay your commission, and if the buyer is looking for, let's say, $100,000 price range, and my commission is 3%, I would recommend trying to negotiate as close to that 3% as I can. I would love to have the retainer end up being the entire 3%, or at least 2%, or 2.5%. Because trust me, if the buyer buys the house by a for sale by owner, or the buyer purchases the house and my commission is not involved in the purchase, I want to make sure that my retainer is enough to make me very comfortable going out and working the transactions for this person. The retainer fee is negotiable. Whatever all parties agree to in writing, that's what it can be. It is no set amount when it comes to the retainer fee. So let's review real quick. We learned about the history of the buyer brokerage agreement, the difference between commercial and residential. We have talked about some pros. We will get paid. We are representing the buyer. We have talked about some pros in the fact that with the buyer brokerage agreement, but we get a retainer fee. We talked about that we are guaranteed a commission with the buyer brokerage agreement. But we've also talked about some cons. It is very popular in the commercial industry. It is very unpopular in the residential arena for both residential home buyers and residential investors. So it's a very difficult sale for the residential buyer brokerage agreement. And then we talked about when should we use it. And I recommend always using it whenever dealing with a for sale by owner. And that's just my minor recommendation. But if you have a business that's booming and striving, and you have a lot of leads, and you are in high demand as an agent, you may always require a retainer fee. But I think the market have to demand it. Most of the time in residential real estate right now, most situations will not demand a buyer brokerage agreement, and so it can be very difficult. It can be very, very tough. But every area, every situation is different. So this is not a blanket statement for everybody and for every situation. What I'm going to do now is I want to open up for some questions and just kind of get some questions and start some questions and answers. So please don't go away. But before I do that, I want to let everybody know I have another training coming out on buyer brokerage agreement where I will go step by step, line by line, discussing the buyer brokerage agreement in detail. So if you are a platinum real estate agent, you can go into the resources within the next few weeks, and you will be able to see a detailed explanation of the buyer brokerage agreement. And I would say please make sure that you review that as well. Okay? Well, great. I am Luther Ragsdale, broker and CEO of Platinum Real Estate. You can always contact me, luther.ragsdale@platinumrealestate.com. You can always give me a call, 404-513-5677. Please hold on and I'm going to open it up for some questions. Hold 1 second.